A single sworn moment detonated across South Africa's political bloodstream before most people even understood what had been said. In a quiet commission room, words normally weighed down by procedure suddenly carried the force of an explosion, linking power, money, and criminal language in a way that could not be unheard. By the time the microphones went cold, the country was already arguing, not about whether the statement was true, but about what it meant if it was even partly true. That is the shock that framed everything that followed, because once the idea of cartel-style influence enters a public record, it never politely exits. What followed was not just testimony, but a slow-burning revelation that the Madlanga Commission was never going to be a neat morality play. It was about systems rubbing against each other under pressure, about how allegations travel faster than verification, and about how institutions like PKTT can suddenly find themselves at the center of a storm they did not initiate. The real payoff in this story is not a single name or headline, but the way one claim exposed how fragile the lines are between politics, policing, procurement, and public trust. Before going further, pause on this question, because it shadows the entire commission. When explosive allegations surface in a formal inquiry, do they automatically advance accountability, or do they sometimes paralyze it by overwhelming the system designed to respond? That tension sits underneath every exchange, every legal objection, and every media reaction that followed. The first stretch of the commission unfolded like a slow tightening of the air in the room. What appeared at first to be familiar territory, complaints about governance failures, hints of political interference, suddenly took on a sharper edge when cartel language entered the record. This was not casual phrasing. In legal and political contexts, invoking cartels does more than accuse individuals. It suggests organized, sustained, and protected wrongdoing. The implication alone was enough to force institutions to respond defensively, even before any finding had been made. As the hearings progressed, it became clear that the Commission's true power lay not in dramatic confrontations, but in its methodical exposure of how decisions are made and justified. Witnesses spoke within narrow lanes defined by lawyers, mandates, and memory. Every answer was both an explanation and a potential liability. The public, meanwhile, often mistook confidence for credibility and hesitation for guilt, even though the commission itself was far more interested in consistency than performance. Understanding the commission's mandate became essential at this stage, because many expectations placed on it were never realistic. A commission of inquiry does not prosecute, does not sentence, and does not raid offices at dawn. Its role is to gather, test, and contextualize information, then recommend action. This gap between what the public wanted, immediate consequences, and what the commission could legally deliver created frustration that colored every subsequent revelation. Evidence, in this environment, behaved very differently from allegation. Testimony could ignite debate, but corroboration determined whether that fire spread or fizzled out. Documents mattered more than declarations. Timelines mattered more than tone. The commission repeatedly returned to paper trails, procurement records, communication logs, and procedural steps, even when the public appetite leaned toward dramatic soundbites. This insistence on process was not weakness. It was the only way findings could survive beyond the commission room. PKTT entered the narrative almost inevitably once the discussion shifted from abstract influence to concrete mechanisms. Suddenly, the conversation was no longer just about who said what, but about how systems designed to prevent abuse might themselves become pressure points. PKTT was not accused in isolation. It was implicated as part of a broader ecosystem where decisions, approvals, and oversight intersect. That shift changed the stakes, because institutional involvement always widens the circle of consequence. Credibility then became the unspoken battlefield. Every witness carried a history, affiliations, and prior statements that were quietly weighed against their current testimony. Inquiries do not simply record what is said. They test how reliably it is said over time. Small inconsistencies, harmless in ordinary conversation, took on outsized importance under oath. Trust was built or eroded not in dramatic moments, but in the accumulation of details that either aligned or did not. Outside the commission, political shockwaves moved faster than the evidence itself. Parties positioned themselves early, issuing statements that were less about facts and more about future insulation. Supporters and critics alike hardened their interpretations long before the commission had concluded any analysis. This rush to narrative created a parallel reality where perception threatened to outpace process, making it harder for eventual findings to land cleanly. One of the most persistent tensions during this phase was the clash between legal thresholds and public expectation. In everyday life, people often equate suspicion with certainty. In law, the distance between the two is vast. Knowing something feels wrong is not the same as proving it meets a legal standard. The Commission repeatedly navigated this divide, aware that clarity for lawyers often reads like evasion to the public. Media amplification intensified everything. Complex exchanges were compressed into headlines that favored conflict over context. Nuance struggled to survive in a cycle that rewarded immediacy. This did not mean reporting was dishonest, but it did mean that the loudest interpretations often traveled further than the most accurate ones. The Commission's work unfolded slowly, while public judgment accelerated daily. As the hearings moved into their second major stretch, overlooked procedural risks began to surface. Some potential consequences were not blocked by conspiracy, but by simple administrative weakness. Missed deadlines, unclear authority lines, and outdated systems quietly undermined accountability. These were not headline-grabbing failures, but they were often the most consequential, because they determined whether any future action could stand up in court. Expert voices entered the conversation with increasing frequency, offering analysis, caution, and sometimes speculation. Their presence helped frame complex issues, but it also introduced a new risk: confusing informed opinion with established fact. The Commission treated experts as guides, not substitutes for evidence, a distinction that was not always clear to audiences hungry for certainty. A dual reality became impossible to ignore. Transparency increased as the Commission exposed more of how decisions were made, yet the likelihood of swift prosecution seemed to recede. Both things could be true at once. More light does not automatically produce more convictions, especially when past processes were poorly documented or legally ambiguous. This contradiction frustrated many, but it reflected the system's actual condition rather than a failure of the inquiry. Institutional memory emerged as a quiet but powerful theme. South Africa has held commissions before, many of which produced detailed recommendations that faded once public attention shifted. The Madlanga Commission operated under this shadow, aware that exposure without implementation risks becoming ritual rather than reform. The question lingered: would this commission alter behavior or merely archive it? Public trust, already fragile, responded unevenly. For some, the commission restored faith by showing that uncomfortable questions could still be asked openly. For others, the absence of immediate consequences confirmed long-held cynicism. Trust did not collapse or recover in a single direction. It fractured along existing lines of belief, making consensus harder to reach. As the microphone switched off and attention drifted, future legal pathways quietly took shape. Referrals, internal reviews, and potential disciplinary processes began moving at a pace invisible to most observers. This phase lacked drama, but it was where the Commission's real influence would either materialize or evaporate. Outcomes would now depend on institutions acting on recommendations rather than rhetoric. Ambiguity became the final enemy. Where findings were clear, response was possible. Where language softened or deferred, speculation filled the gap. Uncertainty invited misinformation, and misinformation fed disengagement. The cost of unclear outcomes was not just confusion, but fatigue, a public sense that following the details no longer mattered. Much of the public commentary missed the quieter signals buried in annexures and technical explanations. Dates that did not line up, approvals that lacked proper authority, and controls that existed only on paper told a story more damning than any single allegation. These details rarely trended, but they defined the Commission's most serious warnings. In the end, the Madlanga Commission's legacy will not be decided by its most explosive moments, but by what happens after attention fades. Exposure is only the first test. Execution is the real one. Whether cartel claims lead to reform, whether PKTT fallout produces stronger safeguards, and whether institutions convert scrutiny into accountability will determine whether this commission becomes a turning point or just another chapter.